I'll be reading a portion from chapter 6, Knowing Your Own Strengths, from the book The Autistic Brain, Helping Different Kinds of Minds Succeed, written by Temple Grandin and Richard Penning. This book was published by Mariner Books, Houghton, Mifflin Harcourt, Boston, New York. First published in year 2003. Chapter 6, Knowing Your Strengths. A few years ago, Michelle Dawson, an autism researcher at the Riviere des Prairies Hospital at the University of Montreal, asked herself an important question. Her research on the autistic brain, like the other autism research at the clinic, like autism research everywhere, focused on cognitive impairment, on what was wrong. And she realized that when an autistic person exhibited characteristics that we would call strengths if they belonged to a normal person, we still saw those strengths as merely the fortunate byproducts of bad wiring. But what if they're not? She asked herself. What if they're not the byproducts of anything? What if instead they're simply the products of wiring? Wiring that's neither good nor bad? Question mark. She and her colleagues began digging in the literature. Sure enough, they found that studies routinely emphasized only the negative aspects of autism, even when some of the results were positive. According to Laurent Motron, Dawson's frequent collaborator and the director of the autism program at Riviere des Prairies Hospital, researchers performing fMRI scans systematically report changes in the activation of some brain regions as deficits in the autistic group rather than evidence simply of their alternative, yet sometimes successful brain organization. When researchers look at cortical volumes, for example, they automatically throw variations into the deficit bin, regardless of whether the cortex is thinner or thicker than expected. And even when a study does recognize a strength in autistic subjects, the authors often regard it as the brain's way of compensating for a deficit. But a 2009 report in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society that reviewed papers based on this assumption concluded that this inverse hypothesis rarely holds true. Dawson and her colleagues began conducting their own experiments to determine the intelligence level of people with autism. In 2007, they designed a study that used two common tests of intelligence, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children and the Raven's Progressive Matrices. The Wechsler test consists of 12 subsets, some verbal and some non-verbal, arranging blocks into designs, for instance. The Raven's totally non-verbal. It consists of 60 questions that show a series of geometric designs and then a choice of 6 or 8 alternative designs, only one of which completes the series. These tests were administered by independent neuropsychologists who were unaware of the purpose of this study. And the test subjects included 51 children and adults with autism and 43 children and adult controls. The results were striking. Dawson found that the measure of intelligence in the autistic population depended on the type of test. On the Wechsler, 1/3 of the test subjects with autism qualified as low functioning. On the Ravens, however, only 5% did so, and 1/3 qualified as having high intelligence. On the Wechsler, the autistic subjects on the whole scored far below the population average, while on the Ravens they scored in the normal range. I myself have scored really well on the Ravens colored progressive matrices. Why such a wide disparity in responses to the two tests? Perhaps because answering many of the Wechsler questions correctly depends on the social ability to acquire skills and information from others, whereas the Ravens is purely visual. We conclude the Montreal group wrote in their groundbreaking study published in Psychological Science in 2007 that intelligence has been underestimated in autistics. Scientists working in autism always reported abilities as anecdotes, but they were rarely the focus of research. One of the authors of the paper says, uh, Isabel Solerius later said, now they're beginning to develop interest in those strengths to help us understand autism. This new attitude towards autism is consistent with the phase 3 thinking that I described in the previous chapter. Just as we can now begin to look at autistic-like behavior on a trait-by-trait basis, we can also reconceive autistic-like traits on a brain-by-brain basis. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that autism is a great thing and all people with autism should just sit down and celebrate our strengths. Instead, I'm suggesting that if we can recognize realistically and on a case-by-case basis what an individual's strengths are, we can better determine the future of the individual. I need you to fix me. Carly Fleischman, the nonverbal we met in chapter 4, once typed, fix my brain. By contrast, when a journalist asked Tito Rajrishi Mukhopadhyay, the other nonverbal we met in chapter 4, would you like to be normal? Tito answered, why should I be Dick and not Tito? For Tito, the acting self might have been weird, but it was no less a part of him than his thinking self. I also want to be clear that when I say strengths, I'm not talking about savant skills like those of Stephen Wiltshire, who needs only one helicopter tour of a portion of a city like London or Rome in order to draw the entire landscape down to the last window ledge, or Leslie Lemke, who needs to hear a piece of music only once, any style including complex classical compositions in order to recreate it on the piano. Only about 10% of autistics belong in the savant category, though most savants are autistic. So what strengths can we look for? While autism researchers traditionally haven't seen this trait as a strength, they have nonetheless noted over the years that people with autism often pay greater attention to details than neurotypicals. Let's start there and see where it takes us. Bottom-up thinking. People with autism are really good at seeing details. When a person with autism walks into a room, one researcher said the first thing they see is a stain on the coffee table and 17 floorboards. That seems an exaggeration and overgeneralization to me, but the idea is on the right track. Traditionally, researchers have characterized this trait as weak central coherence, a deficit. Weak central coherence is at the heart of the impairments in social communication and social interactions that have long been part of the official diagnosis of autism. More informally, you can say that autistic people have trouble putting together the big picture or that they can't see the forest for the trees. Think about Tito and his encounter with the door. He saw the door as a series of properties, its physical features, hinges, its shape, rectangular, its function, allowing him to enter the room. Only when he had collected enough details did he know what he was seeing. When I met him at a medical library, I asked him to describe the room. Rather than discussing the objects in the room or the size of the room, he talked about fragments of color. My experience is nowhere near as extreme, but the tendency to see details before I see the big picture has always been a central feature in how I relate to the world. When I was a child, my favorite repetitive behavior was dribbling sand through my hands over and over. I was fascinated with the shapes. Each grain looked like a tiny rock. I felt like a scientist working with a microscope. A landmark study in 1978, Recognition of Faces, an approach to the study of autism, brought the social implications of this trait to the forefront of research. Subjects were shown only the lower parts of a series of faces of people they knew and asked to identify the people. The autistic population performed better than the controls. The same was true when both groups were shown inverted images. The people with autism were better at figuring out what the image was when it was upside down. The researcher who performed the study, Tim Langdell, posited that people with autism were better at seeing pure pattern rather than social pattern. This interpretation would be consistent with results from biological motion tests. You know motion capture technology in filmmaking, where an actor wears a bunch of white dots that map his movement in a computer? That's biological motion. On a computer screen, biological motion is nothing more than dots moving, but the dots are arrayed in such a way that they suggest an action a living person or animal would perform, like running. Studies have repeatedly shown that people with autism can identify biological motion but they don't do so with the same ease as neurotypicals, nor do they attach emotions and feelings to the motions. What's more, they use different parts of the brain than neurotypicals do. Neurotypicals show a lot of activation in both hemispheres, while autistics show less activation overall. The way the autistic brain engages with biological motion is reminiscent of Tito's description of focusing on a door at the expense of seeing the room, or a description by Donna Williams I once read of her being entranced by individual motes of dust. I'll stop here and you can buy the book and enjoy the rest of it. Thank you.